All right, we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. This morning we're taking one chapter each Sunday. Let me encourage you to try to walk out of here this morning with one of these, an image that you might carry with you this week, a word or a phrase that you might carry with you this week, an action. Maybe you feel God inviting you to do something because of something in Ecclesiastes 3. A prayer that you want to make this week because of something that comes up in chapter 3, or a question that you want to spend some time answering out of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Just try to walk out of here this morning with one of those. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, an overview. First 8 verses are raising the question, what time is it? What time is it? Middle section 9 through 15, a return to the recurring theme of what is the good in life. And then a wonderfully encouraging section at the end of chapter 3, we will all die. So we'll try to end that section so that you are able to start your morning off.
Ain't it the truth?
Just not today.
Hopefully not today. Yeah. All right. Chapter 3, 1 through 8 is probably the most well-known section in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it merits some attention. So we'll spend some significant time in these 8 verses this morning. For everything, there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to tear and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. All right, so this introductory statement of verse 1, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. The main point here seems to be that there is a specifically and presumably divinely appointed time for all things that happen in life. So this is one of the rare times in Ecclesiastes where the preacher seems to acknowledge the role of God in life under the sun. You know, a lot of the time, the focus is very just sort of here and now. In fact, that's going to come up at the end of chapter 3 as he talks about death, and he talks about it largely just in the framework of here and now, not anything beyond this. But the language that's used here is the language of a divine appointment, some kind of divine plan at work. Everything happens in its divinely appointed time. So what difference would it make in your life to think about seasons, events, circumstances as having something divinely appointed about them? Do you find that helpful or not? And why or why not? Yes, Art.
I think, all things are helpful because they help shape you, whether they're good or bad. And so each one contributes to who you are and your outlook in your life. And so the good is better than the bad, but the bad helps as well.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that there's some sense that these are divinely appointed. there's some purpose to it. And even if it's painful, it forms you, it shapes you, it helps you be who you need to be. Yeah. Okay. Someone else, yes.
Well, for me, it's kind of what I try to keep in my mind all the time. It's just a different way of saying it. God is in control.
Okay.
And if he has allowed this to happen, even though it seems like, it's really bad, there is a purpose. And there is, and it reminds me, I think Landon Saunders said ages ago, there's always going to be the trouble. And this is not exactly how he said it, but when you live through the trouble, you wouldn't want to be who you were before.
Mhm.
And I found that in my life, hard things have made me stronger. And I wouldn't want to be the way I was before.
Yeah, good. God is in control, and that can be comforting. It doesn't answer all the questions, but it can still be a helpful perspective.
Well, and in a way, it's nice to think, for me anyway, I don't have to answer all the questions. God has all the answers. And he's working for the good of those who believe in him, worship him.
Yeah.
So,
And one of the things we'll note in the second section is that he acknowledges that while there might be a goal or a purpose, much of the time we can't figure that out. And that's part of the frustration, the heaviness of life. Kendra.
Well, a lot of these things on this list are negative things, bad things, And so the fact that God says there's divine appointment, a time for us to mourn, a time to lose, a time to pass away, that helps me know that it's okay for me to have these feelings. God understands these feelings. It's okay to be going through a rough patch.
Yeah. So it normalizes some of this for us, affirms it for us. Yeah. Julie and
Yeah, I think some of it's interesting because it's all, a lot is about your choices, there's a time to keep and there's a time to cast away. I mean, some of it, so that, it's, because I would always think, it's always a time to embrace. It's not always a time to embrace. It's not a time to embrace. So, there's just a lot of wisdom there.
Yeah.
That's pretty much my point, that most of it's not all that negative. I mean, so often it's grace, it's negative, but it's appropriate. Under these circumstances, this is appropriate.
Yeah.
And it may be the time in this life when you find its meaning and purpose. Shadow is not the right solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Let me just, we're going to get to these pairs here. So let me just hit a few things here. You notice a pattern in the list here. Each verse has two pairs of opposing concepts, generally prefaced with time for. There's a term for this type of structure, and I'm not exactly sure the pronunciation of it. Merismus, in which two extremes are held out, but they are to include everything in between. So we might think about these pairs as all inclusive, that when a pair is thrown up, it includes everything in between the two. The big debate about this list is, are these descriptives, or are these descriptive, that it's just describing, hey, things happen when they're going to happen? Or is this a prescriptive list? That we should be discerning and wise because there's a time to embrace and a time not to embrace. And so we need to figure out what time is it. And so you find some commentators who are on the descriptive side and others who are on the prescriptive side. And I would say there's some of both here. That some like there's a time for war and a time for peace. Well, we may not ever be in a position to start a war, but we're likely to experience some kind of large conflict in our lives. And so this list may give us the perspective of, well, this is part of the course of human life. There's a time when these things happen. They're not going to last forever, and there's a time when they come to an end. There are 14 pairs here, so multiple 7. 7's an important number in the Bible. So the sense of this list is intended to be complete, full, to include the totality of life. Some of the pairs begin with positive words, positive ideas. Others begin with negative ideas, negative words, but the pairs include both there. Okay, Aaron had your hand up.
Well, the word that hits me here and on all of this is the word season. Because, I mean, to throw a cliche in the mix, like the seasons, this too shall pass.
Yeah, so nothing on this list is permanent. There's constant change going on, right? All right, so let's just kind of walk through the pairs here. In some of the verses, the 4 sort of line up with each other. In some of the verses, they don't really line up with each other. So in verse 2, time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. And these will be translated, especially the second one, very different in different translations. But verse 2 seems to be saying the same thing, taking human life into account and taking plant life into account. There are beginnings, births, and times when you plant, and then there are endings. There's a time when humans die, and there's a time when whatever was planted is no longer producing, and so you got to pluck it up because it's no longer really doing what it was intended to do. Now, we don't necessarily choose these times. We didn't choose, I'd like to be born on March 27th, 1968. And we don't choose the timing of our death. But the author seems to be saying here, there's some divine appointment to all of this timing. It is ordained. You're going to be born. If you're here, you were born. And you're going to die. You're going to die. And so I think implicit in between that, the author would be encouraging us to say, now's the time to live. Get busy living. And that's really what the rest of the book is all about, is, okay, what's worth doing between the two poles of birth and death? What is the good thing to do in between those two things? But I think if he were here today, he would say, get busy living. Get busy living. Because you got a brief period here. There's a small span of time when you're here. So live. Make the most of it. In addition, on that second pair, time to plant, time to pluck up. So there's a time to plant things. There's a time to start things that might bear fruit. And there's a time to end things when they're no longer bearing fruit. So I think a helpful question that flows out of the second part of verse 2 is, what do you need to start? Like in this new year, is it time for you to start something, to plant something? Or what do you need to end? Is there something in your life that's no longer really bearing fruit? And it's just time to say, I'm going to move on from that. Whatever it is, it's time to pluck it up because it's just not bearing fruit anymore. So I think that could be a helpful question just to sit with. Verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. So once again, humans and now property, they have endings. Humans can be killed and things can break down. Cars, buildings, computers, bridges, they can break down. So they have endings, but things and people also have continuations. so people can heal and get over an illness, a trauma, an injury, a wound. And things can be built back up. They can be strengthened. They can be fortified. And there's a time to do that. So one thing you might think of is, it's time to heal what? Is there something in your life that it's time to heal? Or it's time to build up or build back up something that needs some fortifying, a relationship, physical structure, something in your career, something in your heart, soul, mind, spirit. What needs to be built up? Is it time to build something up? Verse 4. These two seem to go together. Time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. So these are synonymous, weeping and mourning, laughing and dancing. And so we really err when we don't take time to weep and to mourn. And by the same token, we err when we don't take time to adequately savor, to celebrate the good things that are happening in life. It is appropriate to do both of these things. There's a time to do both of these things. Which would you say comes easier for you? The laughing and dancing, the weeping and mourning? Scott?
I grew up in a Church of Christ, so I don't dance. I grew up in a Catholic church. We don't dance. Dancing is hard.
Yeah. Can laugh though.
Annie?
Honestly, I think it's easier sometimes weeping and mourning, honestly. Sometimes laughing and dancing. I have the same dancing techniques as everybody else in here, but or some other. But that laughing and dancing, sometimes it feels like that it really needs to sort of be justified. Weeping and mourning feels like something you do when something's required of weeping, something's required of mourn. But laughing and dancing is, if you're weeping and mourning, sometimes it feels like laughing and dancing. Not sure when they have to start back up, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so the spontaneity of those, if you are weeping and mourning, I think sometimes it can be tough coming. I'm thinking it specifically from that perspective. I'm going to jump back, then you guys, to the healing, the previous slide. Killing and healing, right? And it was also build up and break down. The interesting thing about that is that often, mostly, medically, physiologically, you can't heal unless you kill something first. You might need to kill certain cells for you to then heal beyond that. Chemotherapy will put that out there. Or kill invasive pathogens before you can heal a wound. You want to build up muscle, you want to build up your capacity, you have to break down the tissue first. It's the only way it's going to happen. So the beauty of those two things is that they're a requirement of one another. And the one that we may consider positive, there's a requirement of the other, of the negative. I think that's really beautiful. I've never seen it before quite so strongly.
Yeah. So interdependence between these,
Yeah.
so at least some of these pairs.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's nice.
And so the next slide, no, I was going to say the next slide, I think it's trying to make the same point. they're interdependent. There needs to be, you need to pair those things up. They're meant to be part of one another. Don't shy from either one of them, really. They're really
Yeah.
meant to be a part of each other.
Right, yeah. What were you saying?
To piggyback on what you were saying, I feel like I have to laugh or I'll never stop weeping. You know, it's like, and then if we don't experience the mourning and the weeping, we can't know the value of laughing and dancing. You know, so it's kind of a little bit like what you're saying.
Yeah, and I would say many of us come from religious streams that are more mind oriented, more intellectual. And I think this is a needed word for those of us in those streams. The emotions matter. There is a time to laugh. There is a time to mourn. And those of us in religious streams that are more intellectual sometimes are not emotionally available to ourselves, to each other, to God. And so I think these things in this list are really helpful, and a call to say, hey, the heart matters, affect matters, emotions matter. And you know, I'll acknowledge my own struggle with this, whether it's personality or upbringing. But I need this nudge to be more emotionally available to experience both sides of the sky.
Yeah, I think in churches, we often honor people that we consider in the middle that don't ever experience any of these extremes. And we say, oh, they're very stable, that's a solid
Yeah.
person, when in reality, the most alive person in your group might be someone who's crying one day and laughing.
Yeah.
the next day.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes we call that drama. Right? But I think Solomon would call it, that's the best way to live.
I have a middle school age daughter, so we understand. We understand that drama.
5, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together. There's some debate among commentators about what's going on here. One of the most plausible explanations is the need to clear away stones from a field to make it useful for agricultural use, or ruining an enemy's field by throwing stones in it. I could not think about Connecticut with this verse, right? I mean, a group of us tried to plant those trees out in front of the parsonage, and you just hit stone after stone. So there's a lot of that going on in Connecticut, casting away stones, if this is agricultural.
Well, you gather them together and just make a wall.
There you go. Yeah,
Around the
that's
property.
where all the walls.
Exactly. That's what I was told also.
Yeah. And the idea of deliberately ruining an enemy's field by throwing stones in it. This is where is this descriptive or prescriptive? Do we now have permission to go and cast stones in an enemy's field? Or the modern day equivalent? Well, probably not. And those things do happen descriptively, right? Those things do happen. I think a good question to ask yourself would be, what stones do I need to remove from my life? I think that'd be a helpful question to wrestle with. One commentator argues that stones is a reference to treasure, wealth, or possessions. So this is very intriguing to me. So there's a time to gather stones together, to gather wealth, right? There's time to gather that, and there's a time to cast it away, to distribute it, to share it with others. And so, what time is it for you? Is this a time to acquire wealth, or is this a time to give it away? Because there's different seasons in life, and that might be a little more helpful than the agricultural use of it. Do you need us, Brother Eddie? Let's,
I'm taking a picture.
okay, all right. A time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. That feels relevant in COVID times, right? But the wisdom here of knowing, well, there are times to hold a person or a group close, and there are times to let them go. And there's some wisdom in discerning what time it is in terms of that person or that group. So the question is, who do you need to hold close, and who do you need to let go of? Don't name anybody out loud.
Sorry.
I didn't want you to name anybody out loud.
No. Anyway,
I'll be leaving that.
sorry. The thing that sprang to mind was sometimes someone that may be in need of a friend or get some support or whatever. And it's just, as a child care person who's been in that field for 40 years, and some of the questions that come up with abuse and stuff, there's a time to embrace that is appropriate and good, and a time when somebody just needs a friend and not that extra pressure. That just sprang to my mind. That's
Yeah.
Something, that happens.
That's good. Yeah. So then that's sometimes a difficult thing to discern.
Not necessarily to push them away,
Mhm.
but just be a friend without, maybe pat their hand or something. But yeah, that's too much.
Right. There's levels of engagement
Right.
in relationships. Yeah. How much do I need to engage here? Verse 6, a time to seek, a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away. So seeking here might be referring to acquiring something. Losing something might be a reference to destroying it or giving it up for loss. Keeping and casting away may be referring to something similar here. So the idea is there are times to seek things, to acquire them. And there's also a time to lose things, or one commentator translates this as throw away. It's a time to throw things away. Now, that can be a helpful thing for some of us who sort of hold on to things, right? Is it what is the time for me to get rid of? Verse 7, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. So some commentators think the first part of the verse, tearing and sowing, is a reference to mourning. So when people are in mourning in the ancient world, there's the rending of garments, right? So again, there's a time to mourn and to express that in relevant ways. But there's also a time to sow. So to take the garments that you tore in mourning, there's a time to sew those back together, because mourning doesn't last forever. And I think that's a really helpful image there. Is it time for me to rend some garments, or is that period through? And it's time for me to bring those things back together again, to put them back together again. Silence and speaking could be related to the first part. So in mourning, there's a time to be silent and there's a time to speak up. And one of the difficult things to discern, especially when someone else is mourning, is whether to say something or not. But in general, it's probably linked to the broad theme in wisdom literature about knowing when to speak up and when not to speak up. A wise person is able to discern those things. So you might just ask yourself, is it time to be quiet or listen? Is it time for me to listen? Or is it time for me to speak out about something? Okay, and then verse 8, time to love, time to hate, time for war, time for peace. These are probably synonyms here. Probably the most challenging in the list, because if it's prescriptive, prescribing behavior, it would seem to conflict with the biblical call to love and forgive. even our enemies, right? I think we could maybe look under the surface here and consider, are there times when it's appropriate for us to war, to engage in conflict? I'm not saying, nation versus nation, although that's also an interesting conversation. But even in our own lives, are there things which are worth conflict? Right? Because sometimes peace could be pursued to the point where no injustice is ever dealt with, right?
Yeah, I think of the verse that says, be what is evil, think what is good. I mean, there's times to make, there's things,
Okay.
maybe not people, but I mean, and like I said, you never really work up about justice if you don't hate something, if you don't really, it's not really bothering you.
Yeah. So righting wrongs in the world will necessitate conflict, right? Or some level of hate. And that could be appropriate.
I also really feel that this is speaking to me in that what is there in my life that I should hate?
Okay.
And I have conflict within myself.
Yeah.
And I want to be reconciled to that.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. So it might be something in our life that we need to hate because it's hurting us, others, God, right? Good. All right, let me just briefly touch on, so there's that list there, list of thought-provoking questions to ask yourself. These will be on the website, by the way.
Really quick, I'm sorry. I'm receiving comfort from this list in a way that I never have before, because the way I'm seeing it is, it's like, yes, but something died or something, was destroyed. It's okay, because there is a light ahead of you.
Yeah.
It's like, it's okay if you're breaking down and weeping and, we don't have to feel despair, because this tells us that there will be that counter to it in time.
Mhm. Yeah. Where we are now, we're not where we're always going to be.
Right.
Yeah, good. Let me just touch on the other two sections here, chapter 3, 9 through 15. He's made everything beautiful in its time. Probably the better translation, he's made everything appropriate in its time. So it's a restatement. For everything, there's a season. It's going to happen at its right time. He has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. Probably what the preacher is acknowledging there is there is a hardwired desire within us to see the greater significance of these things that are happening in time, and a sense within us that these things do have greater significance, and a frustrating inability to work all of that out. And so we live in that tension of understanding deep within ourselves that there's a greater significance to what's happening in these moments of time, and a frustrating inability to completely explain it and understand it. And that's part of the frustration for the preacher there. I'm sorry, let me just touch on these last two things here. So therefore, he says, he goes back to what he had said in the previous chapter. Here's the good. The good is just to be joyful, to do good as long as you live, to eat, drink, and take pleasure in all your toil. So as these things are happening in time, what we do is we take joy in the simple things. The simple things of life become part good. And then we get to the last section here. For what happens to children of man and what happens to the beast is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. All are from dust, and to dust all return. So I saw there's nothing better than a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. So once again, as he will do throughout the book, brings into focus the brevity of life. All things die. There is a time to be born, and there is a time to die. So he ends the chapter returning to the same theme. And somehow we have to come to grips with that, and we have to live in acknowledgement of our ultimate death. And that should actually make life better, not worse. Living in awareness of our death should make life better. All right, we're out of time, so we're going to stop there. These notes will be on our website if you want to look a little deeper. So you guys online, thanks so much for being with us this morning. It's really good to see you.
Have a good week, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.